I went to the restaurant for a company business dinner, as I had so often done, distracted by the numbers of the proposal I would present that night, mentally reviewing the arguments I would use with the client. The atmosphere was elegant, discreet, filled with hushed voices, clinking glasses, and practiced smiles. I ordered a wine while I waited, and when I casually turned my face to the next table, my world froze. She was there, sitting with another man, laughing, touching his arm familiarly, the way she did with me when she wanted me to pay attention only to her. My body stiffened, my breath caught in my chest, and desperation ran through my veins like a fever. I stood up hesitantly and walked to the table, unsure if my eyes were deceiving me. But no, they weren't. It was her. And when she saw me, the color drained from her face, the words seemed to choke in her throat, and, as if by automatic reflex, she blurted out, "It's just a work meeting." A work meeting, at 8 p.m., with wine and complicit laughter. I wanted to scream. But I didn't. I just stared. I don't know how I managed to get back to my table. The client arrived, and I heard words, numbers, laughter, but nothing made sense. My head spun in circles with the image of her smiling at another man, her hands clasped around her glass, her eyes shining for someone who wasn't me. After years of partnership, promises, complicity, travels, plans, and shared pain, that's how I discovered our forever had an expiration date. And yet, I wanted to believe. I wanted to give her a chance to explain herself, even if the explanation was nothing more than a well-dressed lie. Betrayal isn't just a shared bed, it's the silent breach of the trust that once held everything together. She swore it was work. And I, foolishly, accepted it. But the wound was already open. And within her, doubt, discomfort, and foreboding grew. The strange messages. The illogical excuses. The broken schedules. The fake laughter. The absence disguised as fatigue. I investigated, my heart breaking with each discovery. Photos, messages, hotel reservations, whispered audio messages that weren't meant for me. When the truth finally burst forth in every detail, my world fell apart. I already knew, but seeing and hearing the betrayal with my own eyes and ears was like dying standing up. She cried. She begged. She said she was lost, that she felt alone, that she didn't want to lose me. I forgave her, but something inside me no longer beat for her. Forgiveness wasn't a fresh start. It was the quietest, cruelest ending to my story with her. We went our separate ways, though she still texted me from time to time, saying she remembered the smell of our home. The mornings we'd drink coffee together under the blanket. The silent Sundays on the couch, where we didn't need to say anything to be at peace. She remembered everything, as if longing consumed her. But I was already in a different time. I met another woman, a new love, a new lease on life. And when I built a new life, solid and true, that's when the weight of regret seemed to fall upon her. It was then that something happened. She started dreaming about me every night. Not random dreams. Vivid dreams. Real ones. I'd come home. I'd lie beside her. I'd laugh at her jokes. I'd hug her again. She'd wake up, alone, and her pillow, wet with tears, betrayed the longing that was greater than the courage to admit she'd lost me because of herself. She started walking around the house like a shadow. She'd call my old number, even though she knew I wouldn't answer. She'd drive past the places where we'd been happy. She'd sit in the car, staring at the steering wheel, waiting for me to show up. But I didn't. Time passed. And the pain grew in her like an eternal guilt. She began writing letters she never sent. Letters in which he apologized, but not for the messages or the nights with another man. But for having destroyed what she needed most, my love. She said she now understood the value of the silence we shared. The peace that only exists when one loves deeply. She said no one touched her the way I did. That no one knew when she was hurting just by looking at her. That no one was me. She was trapped in a loop of longing, where time didn't heal, only made the bleeding worse. And with each dream I returned, she woke with the memory that I was already someone else's. And that the other now had everything she lost. My eyes. My hugs. My Sundays. She tried to find me one last time. She waited in silence at an event for our daughter, who now treated her coldly and distantly. She waited for me to look at her. For me to say something. But I didn't. I simply held the hand of the woman beside me, firmly, lovingly, and moved on. I learned to heal myself. I learned to love again, without fear. While she learned that some choices are final. That regret doesn't bring back what was burned. That love, when betrayed, dies silently and is reborn in another body, another soul, another future. But there's something neither she nor I have ever told anyone. A letter. A revelation. Something she left me years later, on a night when we were already strangers. Something that would have changed everything if it had come sooner. Something that still wakes me up sometimes, in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, with a question that may never be answered. You think you know what happened. But you don't. You think she just regretted it. But it was more than that. You think it all ended there. But it didn't. What she did after she lost me will leave you devastated. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and will never romanticize any type of betrayal. All stories told are fictional, created with the sole purpose of showing how infidelity destroys lives, corrodes homes, and leaves deep scars. Each narrative is a lesson, a warning, a mirror. Get ready now for a story shocking, emotionally intense and unforgettable. Take a deep breath. The truth is about to hurt. From the beginning, there was something special between Daniel and Helena. It wasn't the kind of love that explodes blindly and impulsively, but rather a feeling that grew over time, with care, with the small gestures that accumulate and make two strangers feel at home. They met at a corporate event, but it was in the silent exchange of glances backstage, over coffee and spreadsheets, that something began to blossom. Daniel was a man with a serene presence, the kind who doesn't need to say much to command respect, with a steady gaze and a calmness that conveyed security. Helena, in turn, had a light of her own. Intelligent, articulate, she enchanted with her sweet yet determined manner. She was the kind of woman who walked into a room and, without raising her voice, made everyone notice her. And when the two began to build something together, it wasn't a movie romance, it was better, it was real, it was solid, it was true. They lived in a house with wide windows, where the late afternoon light painted the walls golden hues. Helena loved those afternoons. Sometimes, without saying a word, she would simply lie on the sofa and watch Daniel preparing coffee, his movements, his large, steady hands holding the cup, the way he glanced out the window before saying something important. That was love in its rawest form, the security of knowing the other person was there, completely. Daniel, in turn, didn't hide his pride in having Helena by his side. He spoke of her with genuine admiration. Never exaggeratedly, but with that truth that reveals itself in the details, like the way he rested his hand on her back as they crossed the street, or the way he watched her sleep, smiling slightly when she snored softly from exhaustion. Together, they created routines that made sense. Sundays were theirs. The leisurely breakfast, the soft music playing throughout the house, the conversations about things that didn't matter but gave meaning to time. They had mutual friends, laughed together at dinners, exchanged confidences in the silence of the night. And even with the rush of the weekdays, there was always a note on the table, a text message at the wrong time, a kiss on the forehead before bed. They didn't live for each other, but they made a point of remembering every day that they were choosing to walk together. That's what made it all so powerful. It wasn't an obligation, it was a decision. Daniel worked in investments and, over the years, rose to prominence. He had a discipline that impressed even the most demanding. He wasn't greedy, but he enjoyed growth, seeing things happen. Helena, meanwhile, worked in communications and had a natural talent for dealing with people. She knew how to listen, knew how to ask the right questions, and this made her indispensable on any team. They supported each other. When one had a difficult project, the other was there, even in silence, holding the fort. And when Helena lost her father, Daniel was with her throughout her grief, even without knowing what to say, just being there. That kind of presence is worth more than words. The pain brought them even closer together. Helena, even hurt, said she only didn't fall apart because she had something to hold on to. The years passed, and with them came the challenges common to any mature relationship. Romance took on new forms. There were no longer long declarations or daily love notes, but there was care, devotion, and partnership. Adulthood brought commitments, responsibilities, bills, and difficult decisions. But they knew how to handle it. They created a kind of silent pact: no matter what came, they would be on the same side. Even when they disagreed, there was never a lack of respect. They knew the value of a good conversation. When something bothered them, they didn't let it fester. They talked, looked each other in the eye, and sought to understand. Helena was a dreamer, the kind who kept notebooks filled with quotes, clippings, and inspiration. Daniel was more down to earth, but he had immense affection for every detail of her personality. Sometimes he would stealthily take one of the notebooks, read her thoughts, and leave notes responding, as if he were communicating with her soul without her knowing. It was these kinds of gestures that fueled the love between them. Small, sweet gestures. And even when the days were overwhelming, they knew they could count on each other. There was never a lack of hugs. There was never a lack of comfort. Their family admired them too. Close friends called them the couple that made it. And this, in a way, placed an invisible pressure on them, to keep everything going. Even when something was bothering them, they felt the need to be strong at all times, that they couldn't allow themselves to weaken. Helena, in particular, felt this. She demanded too much of herself. She wanted to be everything: a perfect wife, an excellent professional, a present friend, a devoted daughter. Sometimes, she lost herself in this search. But Daniel reminded her to breathe. To rest. To not demand so much of herself. They traveled together to many places, but their favorite spot was always that cabin in the mountains. Every time they needed to reconnect, they returned there. There, the world stopped. There was no cell phone signal, no interruptions. Just them, the cold, the sound of the crackling fire, and the sound of the wind through the trees. There, they reminisced about their beginnings, strengthened their bonds, and promised each other they wouldn't let time erode what they had. On one of these trips, Daniel gave her a necklace with a small tree pendant, saying their love was like that forest, strong, rooted, full of life. But even the most solid of loves faces winters. Not winters of fights or anger, but silent winters. Those that arrive without fanfare, occupy spaces, and are only noticed when they've already caused too much cooling. Helena began to feel restless. I didn't know exactly what it was. Everything seemed right, but there was a restlessness, an unnamed emptiness. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe it was fear of stagnation. Maybe it was the pressure to always be happy. Daniel noticed she was more distant at times, but attributed it to stress. He himself had started working more, dedicating himself even more to business. And when she said she felt a little lost, he just hugged her, believing everything would pass. Nights once filled with conversation turned into comfortable silences. Or at least they seemed comfortable. Hands no longer sought each other out as much. Goodnight kisses became routine. There were no arguments. And that might have been the problem: everything was too calm. The kind of calm that, instead of calming, suffocates. But they stayed together. They remained present for each other. They laughed with friends, organized dinners, talked about the future. The plans were still there: a bigger house, a trip abroad, children, maybe. But there was a shadow, a subtle one, beginning to loom. The kind of shadow no one mentions because it seems too small to address, but which, over time, becomes impossible to ignore. Daniel believed that, with time, everything would fall into place. He wasn't naive, but he had faith in what they had built. And Helena, despite feeling the weight of emptiness, never considered giving up. She admired him. She loved that man. She had a deep respect for him. But sometimes, love, even when it exists, can't conquer alone. It takes more. It takes desire. It takes renewal. And she, without realizing it, began to seek it in places she shouldn't. Not practically, but in her thoughts, in idealizations, in memories of what they once were. And, all the while, Daniel continued to believe that everything was in the right place. But nothing was in its right place. On the surface, they were the perfect couple. But inside, something was beginning to break. And no one knew it. Not even them, perhaps. Love isn't lost all at once. It slips through the cracks, slowly. And before you know it, you don't know where it went. Helena, at night, would look at the ceiling and feel a longing she couldn't name. Daniel, at the end of the day, would sit on the couch and feel tired, but couldn't quite put his finger on it. They still hugged. But the embrace was different. And the silence, which had once been peaceful, now hurt. Time passed. Holidays came and went. And there were smiles. But there was also longing. Longing for something that still existed, but was no longer the same. And maybe no one had done anything wrong yet. Maybe it was all just life showing us that love needs to be truly nourished. But when you ignore the small signs for too long, they grow. And once they grow, there's no going back. What came next would change everything. And leave scars neither of them could erase. It was hard to explain what exactly had changed. There had been no major fight, no explicit break. Morning still began with the smell of coffee wafting through the kitchen, the soundtrack of the radio softly wafting through the house, and soft footsteps stomping through the house. Daniel still straightened his tie with the same meticulous precision before leaving, and Helena still closed the door with a quick kiss on his lips. The difference was in the look in his eyes. Or the lack thereof. It was in the lack of questions that once came naturally. In the touch that, instead of seeking closeness, seemed to play an automatic role, almost as if merely maintaining appearances on a stage that no longer had a stage. They still dined together, but the silences were too long, and the smiles came more from habit than desire. Each seemed immersed in their own thoughts, distracted by their own emptiness, and this, little by little, created a distance that was invisible to the eye but suffocating to the soul. Daniel was absorbed in a new project. Negotiating a merger with a large international consulting firm required hours of meetings, short trips, and an intense emotional toll. Helena understood him, or at least tried. At first, she made a point of asking how the meetings were going, if he needed help, if he wanted to talk about it. But over time, she began to distance herself. Not out of ill will, but because she no longer knew how to fit into that world. The dinners she prepared became simpler. The notes left on the table disappeared. The notebook where she jotted down inspiration sat closed on the shelf, gathering dust. When he arrived, tired, she was already in bed. And when she woke, he had already left. They were missing each other every day, even though they lived under the same roof. In an attempt to regain some sense of purpose, Helena started going to a nearby gym after a long time without exercising. She needed to move her body to quiet her mind. There, she made new friends, felt alive again, admired. It wasn't anything that overstepped her bounds. At least not at first. One of the stretching instructors began to be more attentive, more present with small observations, complimenting her performance, talking about books and movies, and she felt heard, seen, desired. It stirred something dormant. It wasn't just vanity. It was an emotional hunger, an invisible need that, deep inside, created a confusing feeling between guilt and pleasure. She returned home changed, lighter, more smiling, but avoided prolonged conversations with Daniel. She was afraid he would notice. And he, immersed in his work, noticed nothing. Or pretended not to notice. The messages started out casual. Conversations about training, music, then feelings. Helen was reluctant at first. He knew he was treading on dangerous ground. But when she found herself telling the other about how lonely she'd been feeling, about how the night seemed too long, about how she'd look in the mirror and no longer recognize herself, she realized she was already emotionally invested. The words flowed easily. The other person made her laugh, reminded her that she was still interesting, beautiful, intense. And as much as she told herself it was just a friendship, deep down, she knew she was deluding herself. The first time they exchanged a more intimate touch was brief, almost accidental. But it was enough for something irremediable to settle inside her. Daniel, for his part, didn't suspect anything. He was proud of Helena, trusted her blindly. To him, she was the most reliable part of his life. But there were times when he felt a disconnect he couldn't explain. A kind of absence in her gaze, a slight shift in her attention when he said something important. Sometimes, he noticed her answering his questions vaguely, as if she were thinking about something else. One night, returning early from a meeting, he found her in the garden, sitting silently, staring into space. When he approached, she forced a smile, but her eyes were red. She said it was just fatigue, that she was overwhelmed. He hugged her, squeezing her tightly, as if he wanted, with that gesture, to glue together all the loose ends between them. But nothing more was said. Time dragged on. And Helena began to split between two versions of herself. The one who came home, had dinner with Daniel, and asked how his day had been, and the one who, in the afternoons, exchanged passionate messages, felt her heart race when she saw the other's name on her phone, experienced brief bouts of euphoria and guilt between coffees. She didn't plan anything. She didn't want to destroy what she had. But at the same time, she couldn't give up that adrenaline rush. She started making up commitments. She said she needed to visit a friend, that she would attend work events, that she would start a course. And Daniel, always understanding, never questioned her. He trusted too much to be suspicious. And that hurt her more than the betrayal itself. What she felt was a strange mix of freedom and imprisonment. She felt alive, but at the same time, she carried the weight of every lie. She slept with a heavy heart, woke up afraid of being discovered. And most contradictory, she still loved Daniel. But she loved him with the guilt of someone who knows she's deeply hurting someone who doesn't deserve it. When she looked in the mirror, sometimes she cried. She felt like she was losing herself, betraying not only her husband, but the woman she once promised to be. Yet, she continued. As if hypnotized by something she could no longer control. Daniel began to notice small flaws. A different scent on her coat. An unexplained delay. A colder way of saying goodbye. But he told himself it was just stress. That every marriage went through rough patches. He decided to surprise her. He called a restaurant they often frequented on birthdays, made a reservation in advance, bought flowers, and wrote a simple but meaningful note. "I'm still yours," it said. He texted her late that afternoon, asking her to meet him there, just like old times. She took a while to respond. He said he'd try to stop by, but he already had another commitment. He felt a pang in his chest, but he hid it. In the restaurant, alone, he ordered a glass of wine. He tried to convince himself she would come. That it was just a setback. He was distracted, fiddling with his cell phone, when he heard a familiar laugh. That laugh he knew so well, the one he'd heard so many times while she lost herself in his arms. He looked up and saw her. Sitting a few feet away, with another man. The light laughter, the deep gazes, the fingers too close, the complicity blatant. His blood froze. He stopped breathing for a few seconds. His mind tried to deny what his eyes saw. But it was real. There was no longer any doubt. He stood up and walked slowly to the table. Her eyes met his, and in that instant, the whole world stopped. Her face drained of color. Her smile disappeared like a castle shattered by a wave. She tried to say something. He simply asked, "Is that so?" She hesitantly replied, "It's just work, an informal meeting." But her voice faltered. The lie fell to the floor with a crash. Daniel didn't say anything else. He just stared. Like someone looking into a broken mirror. He returned to his desk. He sat down. And for a few minutes, he just stood there. Unable to move. That night, he didn't sleep. Or cry. He just lay awake, remembering all the times he'd held her hand, all the promises, all the dreams. Trying to understand when it all slipped away. His chest ached as if it had been ripped open from the inside out. The betrayal wasn't just the act. It was the neglect. It was the choice to be with another when he was still there, whole. In the morning, he left early. He said nothing. She didn't either. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer an absence of words. It was an absence of soul. Of meaning. Of future. But what he didn't yet know was that there was something much bigger behind it all. Something she'd hidden for too long. Something that, when revealed, would completely change everything he thought he knew about her, about himself, and about everything they'd experienced. After that night at the restaurant, the house that once held promises and welcoming silences became an empty space, populated by noises that seemed more like ghosts. Daniel didn't confront her immediately. He spent his days immersed in a cruel stillness, observing everything with surgical precision. Every step, every gesture, every wordlessness was analyzed in silence. Helena, for her part, walked between rooms with the weight of someone who had been discovered but still clung to denial. She tried to maintain her routines, forced a smile where there was no reason to smile, made the bed with an almost pathetic delicacy, as if the sheets could erase what had been done. Daniel saw everything, but said nothing. The silence between them had become a minefield where any word could unleash irreversible pain. It was only days later that he broke the silence. He returned home early and found her sitting on the porch, staring into space. He sat beside her, and for a few seconds, they both just listened to the distant sound of cars. He said he needed to understand, needed to hear from her what had really happened. She hesitated, took a deep breath, and for the first time, with a choked voice, said that she didn't know how it had started, that she hadn't planned it, that she only felt an emptiness she couldn't name, and searched for something that would make her feel alive again. Daniel listened, motionless, his eyes fixed on her, but with the expression of someone far, far away. She apologized, said she never meant to hurt him, that she still loved him, but knew that didn't justify anything. He simply said he couldn't continue living with someone who chose to hide such a painful part of the truth from him. She cried, asked for time to explain herself better, but he didn't answer. He simply got up and went into the house. In the following days, Helena tried to make amends. She sent messages, made dinners, tried to touch on the wounds she herself had opened, but there was no more space. Daniel wasn't the same man. There was no anger in his eyes, there was exhaustion. There was disappointment. He decided to leave home for a while, stay in a hotel, rethink. He said he needed air, needed to understand who he was after all that. She didn't argue. She just watched the door close, feeling the bitter taste of a love she herself had condemned to death. Loneliness began to take on more pronounced forms. The nights grew long, the days too silent. She still texted, but he no longer responded with the same tone. There was a gap between them that no word seemed to fill. Time passed. Months, perhaps. Until, little by little, Daniel began to reclaim his life. He was surprised by an old friendship that discreetly transformed into something more. Someone who didn't judge him, didn't demand anything, who looked at him with a lightness he'd forgotten existed. It was a kind of connection that didn't scream, but comforted. And it was in this subtle rebirth that he found breath. He began to reorganize his life, change plans, dream again. And just when he thought everything was finally stable, when the past seemed like a distant shadow, a letter arrived. A handwritten letter, in the handwriting he recognized with his eyes closed. Helena had written each word with a broken heart, and inside that envelope, there was not just a plea for forgiveness, but a revelation that would shatter everything he believed in. She said that, in the weeks following the separation, she began having constant dreams about him. But they weren't mere memories. They were vivid, intense dreams, in which she saw him returning home, sitting at the table, drinking coffee, smiling as before. In each dream, he looked at her with tenderness, with love, with everything she knew she had lost. But when she woke, the pillow was wet with tears, the room was cold, and the emptiness was deeper than ever. For the first few days, she thought they were just echoes of longing. But the dreams began to repeat themselves with absurdly real detail. One day, in the dream, he said a specific phrase she hadn't heard in years, something only they knew. It made her wake in tears. Her despair grew with each night. In one of them, she saw him with another woman. A woman who looked at her and smiled, while he ran his fingers through his new wife's hair. Helena screamed in the dream, begging him to look at her. But he wouldn't. She began writing all of this down in the old inspirational notebook that sat forgotten on the shelf. Each dream was recorded in detail. But the worst was yet to come. In one dream, she woke up next to him, as before, but when she tried to touch him, he disappeared. And when she looked in the bedroom mirror, she saw herself completely alone, as if her reflection screamed the truth she tried to ignore. She was living with a ghost, an echo of everything she destroyed. It was then, in the middle of the night, that she finally understood. This wasn't just longing. It was the mourning of what she'd killed. The awareness of the love she'd driven from her life. It was her heart in agony, crying out for something that would never return. Daniel read it all in silence. His hands were shaking. It was difficult to process. That letter, full of pain and confession, wasn't an attempt at reconciliation. It was a plea for understanding. At the end of the letter, there was an even more devastating revelation. She said that, in the last week before she was discovered, she had finally decided to end things with the other man. That she had returned home that day with the intention of telling him everything, opening up the truth, begging for forgiveness. That, deep down, she didn't want that other man. That she had let herself be carried away by neediness, illusion, and vanity. But the moment she saw him standing in the restaurant, looking at her with that expression of disbelief and pain, she knew it was too late. That the time she thought she had was gone. But what took his breath away was the last page. Where she said that, after he left, she began searching for him in her dreams with a silent obsession. That she cried every night because, even with the distance, she still felt his presence. That one morning, she dreamed of him holding an envelope, just as she had just done. And that, in that dream, he said, "Now you understand." She woke in tears and, in that moment, knew she had to write everything down, even if he never responded. Because the pain of living with regret was greater than the pain of knowing he wouldn't return. Daniel left the letter on the table. He ran his hands over his face. His heart was broken. Not because he wanted to go back, but because he now understood the depth of her pain. He didn't reply to the letter. He didn't call. He just kept it. And that night, for the first time since the end, he dreamed of her. In the dream, they were in the mountain cabin, the place where they promised never to let time wear away what they had. She looked at him, but her eyes were filled with tears. He held her hands and, in a calm voice, said, "You lost me when you thought you had time. And when I woke, I knew there was nothing more to say. But I also knew that, somehow, that love, even dead, still pulsed somewhere in time, where they were both still whole. Where she still loved him without fear. And he still believed that love was enough." Daniel spent the night awake after reading the letter. The entire dawn stretched out like an empty road, and he didn't want to sleep. He opened the windows, let the icy wind in, sat in the armchair in the corner of the room, and stared at the dark sky until dawn. Helena's letter lay on the table, like a ghost that no longer haunted but still hurt. He didn't cry, didn't smile, didn't curse, he simply remained silent. There was a strange peace in understanding everything she carried, but there was also a harsh clarity. None of it brought him back to the past. Understanding wasn't enough to restore love. Sometimes pain clarifies, but doesn't rebuild. When the sun rose and the city began to wake, he got up, made a strong coffee, and prepared to move on, even with the invisible marks of that story imprinted on his soul. At the end of that same week, due to a social commitment, Daniel attended an event with former university classmates. It wasn't something he really wanted to go to, but he thought his presence would be interpreted as maturity and stability. He no longer carried the somber expression of before, there was something in his gaze that conveyed resilience. The atmosphere was light, with spontaneous conversations and warm reunions. It was there that he met Julia again, an architect with whom he'd exchanged few words during college, but who now, years later, seemed to have been honed by time in the same way he had. The two recognized each other with sincere smiles and began chatting like old friends who had never really met. The exchange was natural, unpretentious, and Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, lightness. His conversations with Julia became frequent. There was none of the passionate urgency of youth, nor the suffocating expectations of a new romance. Everything happened in a balanced way. She didn't ask questions about the past, respecting the space he still held, and this made him want to be closer to her. They were a few discreet, unhurried encounters, simply a genuine exchange between two people who knew the value of silence and the weight of pain. Daniel smiled differently around her, calmer, more whole. And, for the first time, she thought that perhaps love wasn't a one-time chance that, once lost, would never be found again. Perhaps love could also be rebuilt, in another way, in another time. Meanwhile, Helena walked in another direction. Alone, living in the same house where she'd spent her best and worst years alongside Daniel, she felt time passing like a silent punishment. She tried to move on, tried to distract herself, sought refuge in therapy, yoga, and quick trips, but nothing filled her. Regret is a dark room without windows. She remembered everything, and now the dreams had ceased. There were no more visions, no more subconscious messages. The silence was total. One night, she decided to write to him again. She didn't expect a reply. She simply wanted to say she was happy he'd moved on. That he deserved to find the peace she'd failed to preserve. But she didn't send it. She crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash. Her pain was now silent, resigned. Their reunion happened by chance, months later. A chance encounter, in a discreet cafe near the center. Daniel was with Julia, holding hands, laughing at some random story. Helena entered the place, not expecting to see them. Upon noticing them, she froze for a few seconds. Time seemed to play with the irony of that moment. Julia noticed Helena's fixed gaze, turned to understand, and Daniel, noticing his ex-wife's presence, simply waved politely, almost formally. Helena responded with a restrained wave, and before any awkwardness could set in, she turned and left. Outside, she wept silently. Not out of jealousy. Not out of anger. But because, in that moment, she understood definitively that he truly was no longer hers. It was an unspoken farewell, a morning without a wake. A page turning on its own before her eyes. Days later, a mutual friend contacted Daniel, asking him to come to Helena's house. She was in crisis, emotionally distraught, and had asked to be seen if anything happened. Reluctant, but still human, he went. He found her sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by mementos scattered across the carpet, photos, old notes, hidden gifts. She was silent, her eyes swollen. Seeing him, she said nothing for a few seconds. He approached, crouched beside her, and waited. Helena then began to speak, without asking permission. She said she expected nothing from him. She just wanted him to know that every memory stored there had been true. That everything they experienced was real, even if she had destroyed it. That the pain she carried came not only from loss, but from the regret of not having appreciated it when there was still time. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he simply said that the love that existed between them would never be erased. But it also couldn't be revived. That the pain, for him, was no longer a wound, it was a scar. And scars don't hurt, but they don't disappear either. Helena nodded. She didn't ask for anything else. She simply thanked him for coming. He stood, looked one last time at the scattered photos, and left. On the street, he took a deep breath. It was a silent, undramatic closure. A conclusion without shouts. The kind that only time can write. Weeks later, Daniel and Julia traveled together. They chose a simple place, surrounded by nature and a relaxed atmosphere. During a hike along a trail, Julia asked him if he felt ready to truly start over. He looked around, felt the wind on his face, and replied that, for the first time, he didn't feel divided. That the past existed, but it no longer guided his steps. That the new love wasn't a replacement, but a rebirth. And that he was there, whole. Julia smiled, held his hand, and they moved on. That same night, Helena opened her old notebook again. The one filled with inspiration, with dreams. For the first time, she wrote something other than about Daniel. She wrote about herself. About what she'd learned. About what she'd lost. About what she still hoped to rebuild within herself. The pain was still there, but there was also a subtle longing for healing. She knew she'd never have him back. He knew the love of her life was now in the arms of another woman. And she accepted it. Because she understood, the hard way, that love isn't measured solely by what you feel, but by what you preserve. And she didn't preserve it. In that story, there was no turning back, but there was learning. Daniel moved on. Helena stayed. And in this mismatch of fates, time taught them both that true love can be lost, and that, once lost, it can't always be recovered. But it also taught them that starting over is possible. That pain doesn't have to be a sentence. That life doesn't end with the end of a relationship, but begins again with the ability to learn from it. And even apart, each, in their own way, still carries the traces of everything they experienced together. Not as a wound, but as history. And some stories don't need a return to be unforgettable. The afternoon fell silent, as if time, too, were tired of carrying that story. Daniel and Julia returned from their trip with hearts lighter, but not numb. There was a quiet maturity between them, forged not only by their individual pain, but by the mutual respect they built day after day. They didn't demand eternal promises from each other, knowing that everything said under pressure loses its luster over time. They simply gave themselves to each other with presence and honesty. Daniel knew there were still parts of him rebuilding, scars that, though closed, still tugged at the slightest emotional movement. But Julia didn't demand perfection, only truth. And that was all he had to offer at that moment. It was this kind of calm, almost shy love that began to heal him completely. It wasn't a hurricane, it was a shelter. A safe place after the storm. Meanwhile, Helena, as much as she avoided admitting it, felt time passing unevenly. Some days sped by, others dragged on like endless hours. Within her, there was a constant attempt to avoid falling back into the abyss of self-pity. She tried to occupy herself with new things, she resumed personal projects, took courses, read books on human behavior, immersed herself in deep therapy, and sought answers in places she had never imagined before. But no answer took her away from what hurt most, the fact that, even if she was becoming better now, it was too late for what truly mattered. The idea that personal growth only came after definitive loss slowly consumed her. There were times when she walked around the house as if surrounded by ghosts, by past versions of herself that now seemed distant and unrecognizable. And the hardest part was realizing that, no matter how much it had changed, the past remained intact, carved into every wall, in every memory, in every corner of the house where love had once lived. The news that Daniel was engaged to Julia reached her through third parties. It wasn't said directly, announced on social media, or posted in photos with happy captions. It was a casual comment during lunch with acquaintances, but it pierced like a blade. He masked the impact with a polite smile, but inside, something shattered again. That confirmation that he hadn't just moved on, but had rebuilt his life with another woman, definitively closed off any possibility of a return, even if only in the realm of fantasy. And it was there that the moral dilemma presented itself cruelly: should repentance entitle someone to try to regain what they lost? Or did true forgiveness consist of accepting the loss as a just consequence of one's own choices? Helena spent days reflecting on this. She began writing in her notebook again. Not about Daniel, nor about the guilt. But about who she had become. For the first time, she wrote a letter to herself. A letter admitting that she had betrayed not only the man who loved her most, but also the woman she had promised to be. That she had lost herself trying to be seen by others when she was already admired by someone who loved her silently. That she had traded depth for distraction, stability for adrenaline. And that now she carried the emptiness not as punishment, but as a permanent reminder of what is destroyed when one acts impulsively. She tucked this letter away on the last page of her notebook. She didn't intend to show it to anyone. But she needed to write it down. She needed to face it. Daniel, for his part, dove into the new chapter with caution and serenity. There was no rush to get married, to start over with rituals. There was only the desire to walk alongside someone who understood him. Julia accompanied him patiently, without intruding. The two planned a new home, far from the vestiges of the past, with open windows and furniture chosen together, meticulously. It was like rebuilding his soul brick by brick, without rushing. He began to look at life with a more attentive, more sincere gaze. He didn't expect perfection or fairy tale endings. He expected only reciprocity. The trust that had once been destroyed was now carefully cultivated with small gestures, clearly spoken words, and active listening. He relearned to surrender, even after being broken. Helena received an unexpected invitation to an art exhibition, in which she would participate with a painting she had produced in recent months. It was a dense, abstract piece that expressed loss and reinvention. She agreed to participate. She knew he might be invited, but she went anyway. She needed to face life head-on, without running away. On the day of the event, their eyes met again. There was no surprise, no explicit pain. Just a silent recognition. He approached her, complimented the painting, and said he was proud to see her expressing all that with such intensity. She thanked him with moist eyes, saying it was only possible because she had been through what she had. Daniel simply nodded and, before leaving, held her hand for a few seconds, with respect, with old-fashioned affection, and said he hoped she would be happy, truly. That night, Helena arrived home and, for the first time, didn't cry as she lay down. There was a shy peace within her chest. A gentle, painful, but necessary acceptance. Time wouldn't heal everything, but it would allow her to learn to live with the consequences. She put the notebook away in the drawer, and in doing so, she understood that that phase was over. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew she would no longer be a prisoner of the past. She still loved him, perhaps for a long time to come. But love, sometimes, needs to live in silence so as not to turn into bitterness. Daniel, now back in his routine with Julia, was preparing for a new trip. They were about to start a social foundation together, something he had never considered before. He wanted to give back to the world some of what he had learned. To help people through difficult emotional processes, to offer support to those who feel they've lost everything. Perhaps, in a way, this was his way of making sense of the pain he'd experienced. He understood that some experiences don't come to punish, but to form. And that when we can transform pain into purpose, it ceases to be a wound and becomes strength. Nothing would ever be the same again. Neither of them would ever be who they were. And that, contradictory as it seemed, was a good thing. What Daniel didn't know was that, years later, one of the people the foundation would help would read a column Helena had published under a pseudonym. A dense, emotional text, in which a woman told the story of a betrayal and the regret that followed. The column would touch many people. It would be shared, commented on, discussed. And even without knowing who wrote it, Daniel would read it by chance one morning. He would recognize every word, every pain, every silence between the lines. He would close his laptop with teary eyes and, for a moment, feel time fold around him. He wouldn't try to find out if she wrote it. He wouldn't send a message. He would simply smile with his eyes closed, finally accepting that some stories don't need happy endings. They just need a fair ending. Helena began visiting museums frequently. She spent hours walking between rooms, observing works that somehow managed to express everything she couldn't yet put into words. On one visit, she stood before a painting where a woman's face dissolved into rough, formless brushstrokes. It was as if she herself were there, blurred by everything she had been, everything she tried to be, everything she couldn't maintain. She began studying painting, first out of curiosity, then out of necessity. With each stroke, she seemed to extract a pain from her soul and place it on canvas. She created a small series of paintings inspired by phases of emotional grief. She didn't show them to anyone. It was too intimate. But it was there, in that makeshift studio in Daniel's old office, that she rediscovered a bit of herself. The walls were covered in intense colors, strong lines, and little by little, that space previously inhabited by harsh words and heavy silences transformed into a refuge of expression. It was on one of those afternoons, amid the smell of paint and a whirlwind of memories, that he received an unexpected message. It was from Daniel's sister. They had grown apart since their separation, and Helena never expected any bond to still hold. But there it was, the message, simple, direct, asking them to meet. She arranged to meet for coffee, her stomach churning as if she were about to face an invisible tribunal. On the day of the meeting, she arrived early, trembling inside. When she saw her sister-in-law enter, she felt like running away, but she stayed. The conversation began tensely, the greetings formal, the air heavy. Until, surprisingly, his sister said she needed to understand. She said she would never condone what Helena did, but she also knew that a story always has more than one version, more than one layer. Helena didn't defend herself. He said he was wrong, very wrong. That he didn't expect forgiveness from anyone. I just wanted the chance to say, looking her in the eyes, that her pain was as real as the pain she caused. He told her about the transformation, about the painting, about the days he wished he'd disappeared to avoid facing the consequences. Daniel's sister listened in silence. And in the end, with tears in her eyes, she said she didn't know if she could forgive, but that for the first time, she understood. And that maybe this was a start. Julia, on the other hand, experienced the challenges of relating to someone who carried such a dense history. Daniel was present, caring, but there were days when he seemed emotionally absent, as if being dragged back into a memory. She didn't demand it, but she noticed. And, over a quiet dinner, she asked if he still dreamed about the past. Daniel was honest. He said sometimes he did, but not because he wanted to go back, but because some stories leave scars too deep to ever disappear. Julia held his hand and replied that she didn't care about the scars, as long as he didn't let them guide his steps. He smiled, moved, and promised he wouldn't. And in that moment, he felt truly loved not only for who he was now, but also for everything he had survived. Their wedding was scheduled for the end of the year. Nothing grand, but significant. A small event, with close friends and family who had witnessed their rebuilding. Daniel invited his sister to be one of the witnesses. Helena, upon learning this, smiled sadly. She knew she wouldn't have a place there, not even as a keepsake. But she didn't want one either. She had overcome the illusion of return. She wanted to move forward with dignity. And that meant not invading his new cycle with echoes of the old. She began planning a solo exhibition featuring the paintings she had created. A curator saw her work and took interest. For the first time, she felt she could be recognized for something she had built alone. A new name, a new meaning. The day before the exhibition, Helena received a package from an unknown sender. Inside the box was an envelope with a single sentence: "You managed to rebuild yourself in a way I never imagined possible." It was in Daniel's handwriting. No signature. No request. Just acknowledgement. Beside the envelope was a book of poems. On the back cover, a discreet dedication, for those who understood that pain can be a seed. Helena wept. Not for lost love, but for realizing that, even from a distance, he recognized who she had become. There was no more hurt. There was respect. And that was rarer than forgiveness. On the night of the exhibition, the gallery was packed. Helena walked among the paintings as if leading an audience into her own soul. People were moved. Some wept before the works. Others asked questions, wanting to understand the process. In the midst of the crowd, she saw someone standing alone before the central canvas, the one depicting the shattered woman remaking herself in color. It was Daniel's sister. She approached, and the two embraced without saying a word. And, with her eyes fixed on the canvas, her sister said, "He would be proud of what you've done here." "I am." Helena thanked him, her voice choked, her heart filled with gratitude. That was the validation she hadn't expected, but it meant everything. Meanwhile, Daniel and Julia were organizing the final details of their wedding. He no longer spoke of Helena, no longer read the letters, no longer relived his dreams. But there was something new in his way of living, a lightness that only comes when one chooses to accept that some pains must be felt so that other joys can be earned. Julia said he smiled with his eyes now. And he said it was because, finally, he felt whole. A month before the ceremony, Daniel decided to visit an orphanage supported by the foundation he and Julia would create. There, he met a girl with eyes very similar to Helena's. He couldn't explain why this touched him so much. The girl hugged him tightly, as if she'd known him for years. On the way back, he remained silent. Julia respected this. When they arrived home, he said he wanted their wedding to be not just a milestone, but the beginning of something bigger. That he wanted to create a new story, with more people, with more impact. Julia smiled and said they were already doing that. And in that moment, everything seemed to fall into place. Days after the exhibition, Helena received an invitation to participate in a cultural program about art and overcoming adversity. She accepted. On the program, she spoke about choices, the price of our actions, and how it's possible to rebuild even after failing the one we love. She didn't name names. She didn't share details. But those who listened understood the depth of what she carried. The messages of support were numerous. People who saw themselves in that pain, who found strength in her redemption. And Helena realized that, even without turning back, it was possible to move forward with dignity. It was in this scenario, with two destinies now completely separated, that life began to show signs of completion. Daniel and Julia lived happy, serene, simple days. Helena was immersed in a new artistic cycle, mature, and focused. And even without direct contact, there was an invisible thread of respect between them. A silent recognition that this story, which began with promises and ended with goodbyes, had left scars that would never be forgotten, but which would also no longer be a source of pain. Because, in the end, what each of them did with their pain was what truly defined how this story would be remembered. The wedding night was shrouded in unusual serenity. The sky was clear, the soft lights reflected in the attentive eyes of the guests, and the delicate sound of a string quartet lulled the steps of those arriving. There was no excess in the decorations, no ostentation in the details. There was meaning. Every element of the celebration had been carefully thought out, as if they were small tributes to the new beginning of two lives that had once been fragmented and now chose to walk side by side. Daniel observed everything with a rare tranquility, the same one feels when one finally finds one's place in the world. As Julia walked down the aisle with her eyes fixed on his, there were no disturbing memories, no ghosts from the past trying to assert themselves. There was only that absolute moment, where pain gave way to gratitude. He held her hand firmly, and in that gesture was contained everything he had been unable to say in the years he had remained silent in the face of disappointment, that yes, it was possible to begin again, but only when the soul chose to be honest again. After the ceremony, dinner continued in an intimate celebratory tone, filled with sincere laughter and knowing glances. Daniel's speech was brief but direct. He thanked those present, not only for their presence, but for believing that even broken hearts can be restored. He said that love is not an instant miracle, but a daily choice, and that Julia had taught him to choose lightly. Hearing this, she looked at him tenderly, and a silent tear ran down her cheek, not of sadness, but of understanding. In that brightly lit room, everything seemed peaceful. Friends said goodbye with lingering hugs, and when the night finally gave way to silence, they both knew that from then on it was no longer about forgetting what had passed, but about building something where there would be no more room for old mistakes. That same day, Helena opened her exhibition at a gallery in another city, unaware of the exact date of Daniel's wedding. She had decided to distance herself from social media, close contacts, and anything that might invite comparisons or unsolicited news. The opening was a success. Critics praised the emotional depth of the canvases, the way the lines seemed to tell stories without words. A journalist approached during the cocktail reception and said he had never felt so much empathy for a work. Helena smiled and thanked him, but didn't say much. She was still learning to accept compliments without distrusting them. She walked through the gallery like someone who had learned to walk again, with firmer yet careful steps. At the end of the evening, she was the last to leave. She remained alone before the central canvas, the same one where she had depicted the woman undergoing reconstruction. There, before that reflection of herself, she understood that true forgiveness is when one can face one's own mistake without trying to erase it, but rather transform it into something that can teach, touch, and inspire. Days later, Helena received an offer to take the exhibition abroad. It was a big deal, perhaps the greatest professional recognition of her life. There was a quiet excitement, mixed with a genuine fear of leaving what had become her new home. But she accepted. Not just for her career, but because she understood she could no longer live anchored to the past of a single love. The plane took off on a cloudy morning, and as she looked out the window, she wrote one last sentence on her phone before hanging up: "May I never again betray myself by trying to be who they expect me to be." It was a promise. To herself. To the woman who had almost lost herself. And who now knew exactly how to get back. Months passed. Daniel and Julia were now living in a house surrounded by trees, with an adopted dog that had become part of the family and the foundation papers already signed. He wrote chronicles in silence, many of them inspired by the stories of overcoming adversity he heard through social work. One in particular resonated with him, a young woman who had been betrayed by her husband and abandoned with 2 children, but who, despite this, decided to continue studying, working, and raising her children with dignity. When she received a scholarship from the foundation, she called in tears to thank them, saying she now believed in humanity again. Daniel hung up the phone with a heavy heart, remembering everything Helena had also experienced. He realized, in that moment, that the good he was doing now was perhaps, unconsciously, a way of repairing not only his own pain, but also everything he couldn't prevent from happening back then. Julia, noticing his distant gaze that night, approached, hugged him from behind, and whispered that he was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. And he replied that, for the first time, he felt that he no longer owed anything to anyone, not to the past, not to pain. Helena, now on foreign soil, became a reference in emotional art. Her works ended up in private collections, and universities began using them in studies on resilience and human behavior. She was invited to give a lecture on forgiveness, where she spoke without naming names, but with her soul wide open. She said that the most difficult betrayal to forgive is the one we commit against ourselves, when we give up what is right to satisfy our ego, our impulses, our desires of the moment. She said that some people may never forgive us, and that's okay. The important thing is not to remain the same person who made the mistake. And that true forgiveness is the kind that transforms the guilty into someone worthy of trust, even if that trust is never given again. At the end, she received a standing ovation. But more important than the applause was the feeling that, even without being understood by everyone, she now understood herself. And that was freedom. A year later, Daniel wrote a book. Not autobiographical, but clearly inspired by real pain. The title was discreet, What We Are Made of After the Fall. He published it independently. The book reached thousands of readers. People who saw themselves in its pages, who felt as if every paragraph had been written for them. He received letters, messages, invitations for interviews. In one of them, he was asked if the book was inspired by a personal experience. He simply replied that all pain, if well cared for, can teach us how to love better. And that sometimes, the ending that seems most cruel is the only one possible for two hearts to learn the truth, that love is not about never failing, but about never abandoning the other within the failure. The interviewer, moved, thanked him. And Daniel concluded by saying that love is a verb that only makes sense when conjugated with truth. Helena read the book. In silence, on a calm morning. She didn't look for Daniel. She didn't tell anyone. But she cried for almost an hour. Not out of sadness. But because she saw that, even without a happy ending, their story still sparked light. She knew that, even without mentioning names, those pages were hers too. And she understood that some stories, even if they end, don't die. They become art. A lesson. A legacy. And so ends this story. A story that shows how betrayal has the power to destroy families, disfigure loves, and change destinies. But it also shows that pain, when faced responsibly, can become a bridge instead of a prison. That reconstruction is possible. That forgiveness, sometimes, isn't a return, it's liberation. Now tell me, what did you think of this story? Would you have acted like Daniel? Would you have forgiven? Or would you have repented like Helena? Write here in the comments, I'd love to hear your opinion. And if you're not already a subscriber, subscribe now for more moving stories like this. Every week, a new story will make you reflect on love, loyalty, and choices. Remember, this channel does not support, encourage, or justify any type of betrayal. Our mission here is to show, through fiction, what infidelity can cause in real life. May this story inspire you to value those by your side and never forget that trust, once broken, can be forgiven, but it never returns the same.